Welcome back, everyone. Also, a very warm welcome to those of you who are joining us just now. So, while the first block provided an excellent overview on hugely important questions like community resilience and intersectionality, our second block of the day will take this conversation forward and answer critical questions around emerging policy and market scenarios related to green trade and international partnerships in the broader context of G20. Therefore, I'm happy to welcome Mr. Koyel Kumar Mandal, Chief of Programs at Shakti Sustainable Energy Foundation, who will introduce the high-level keynote speakers of this session.
Thank you. And welcome once again to everyone as we shift gears from the morning session where we largely looked at resilience, community action, local action, to navigating the more complex interlinkages between trade, investment, climate change, and cooperation. If you look at trade and globalization, it has offered immense benefits over the last several decades. Economies have grown. There have been a lot of developmental gains. Millions of people lifted out of poverty. But it has also flip sides. It has resulted in a lot of externalities in terms of emissions and climate change as well. Simultaneously, climate change also impacts trade in different ways, mostly by changing the comparative advantages the different countries have in terms of their export potential. Even if you look at the clean energy transition, for example, the way in which trade is being reshaped and reformed, there are new economies emerging as exporters of clean technologies, for example. And not just that, even the providers of critical raw materials and minerals that are required for producing these clean technologies. And you add to all of this the current geopolitics, it's an entirely complex environment. For example, if you look at the Russia-Ukraine war, the widening wedge between US and China, the tensions over Taiwan, you pull together the trade tensions on climate front along with the geopolitical issues, it becomes a really complex atmosphere to navigate. So what can the appropriate policy response and business response be in this circumstance? We have already seen different countries take very ambitious climate actions in their respective geographies. What this also means is that stricter action in a certain geography, for example, the European Union, might lead to carbon leakages. Production might shift to other territories. So we have seen this being addressed in terms of tariffs that are in alignment with climate goals, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, for example, of the European Union. We have also seen the recent initiative by the G7 on the Global Climate Club. So these are all measures to harmonize such actions. On the other side, we also see that many of these actions, investments by different countries are seen as protectionist, for example. The Inflation Reduction Act of the US is under criticism. EU in certain respects is also following the same course of action. In our own country, India, we have the production-linked incentive, which is also a form of domestic production, giving incentives for domestic production. So in this kind of fragmented landscape, what does cooperation really mean? How do you de-risk trade? How do you enable cooperation in a manner that there's greater investment flow towards clean technology, towards cleaner production processes? And what kind of cooperation frameworks are therefore ideal for these long-term green investments? So we'll have our panelists answer some of those questions. But with that context, let me invite Dr. Mukund Rajan to share some of his insights on these questions. Dr. Rajan is the chairman of eCube Investment Advisors. In the past, he's also led several leadership positions within the Tata Group. Dr. Rajan also serves as the chairperson of the Environmental Committee of the Federation of Indian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. So with that, let me hand the stage over to you, Dr. Rajan.
Good afternoon, everyone. And let me first, of course, thank the organizers, the Astra, F20, and of course, the Shakti Sustainable Energy Foundation for inviting me to address this Climate Solutions Forum. And I just want to clarify, my keynote address was intended to be on the subject of life or lifestyle for environment. So I'm not addressing the issues which Mr. Jayant Sinha was expected to, which probably pertain to the first panel So my apologies if this falls short of what the audience may be expecting from the keynote address. And of course, I'm very conscious that there are going to be a number of very well-qualified experts who are going to be shedding more light on this subject in a little while. But what I thought I would do in my opening keynote is really to try and set some context, offer a few insights, and table a few questions possibly for the panelists. And then I'm hoping that Manu from Shakti will then take some of that on board when moderating the subsequent discussion. So as most of us are familiar, life or lifestyle for environment was announced by the Indian Prime Minister Modi, at COP26, the Conference of Parties on Climate Change in Glasgow in 2021. Now, when he introduced the concept, and I think it's worth picking out the exact words that he used, and I'm quoting from what he said at that point, quote, "This one word in the context of climate can become the basic foundation of one world. Today, there is a need for all of us to come together with collective participation to take life forward as a campaign. What is needed today is mindful and deliberate utilization instead of mindless and destructive consumption," unquote. While broader environmental compulsions certainly guided the Prime Minister's commentary at that point, it's also clear that the urgent crisis represented by global warming was a key consideration in his speech at Glasgow. The Indian government has consistently argued in favor of per capita equity when seeking to control climate change, inducing carbon emissions. And this per capita principle assumes criticality given India's ambitions to grow its per capita income and achieve upper middle income economy status by 2047, when the Indian Republic, the Indian nation would have achieved its 100th year of independence. So life then can be seen as a way to move all of humankind towards a universally accepted set of consumption practices that ultimately ushers in a circular global economy. And this is, I think, very much part of India's agenda at the G20 to champion this idea and to bring it into the vocabulary of the international community. And towards this objective, the government has identified three very well thought through phases for executing. The first focuses on promoting environment-friendly actions by individuals in their daily lives. It recognizes that raising awareness among consumers is vital for cultivating a culture of sustainability, and stakeholders such as our schooling system, our teachers, advertisers, the media, social media influencers, and nonprofits must play a proactive role in educating consumers about sustainable alternatives. The second phase, and these phases don't necessarily have to follow only sequentially, the government concedes that they can run in parallel. The second phase seeks to bring about a transformative response from industry and markets through alignment of supply and procurement with the large-scale transformation of individual demand. And then the third and final phase aims to effect long-term shifts in industrial and government policies globally to promote sustainable consumption and production on a global scale. And we're seeing that work on all three phases of mission life is ongoing in India, from incentivizing the adoption of electric vehicles to planning for the full electrification of India's largest freight and people mover, the Indian Railways, to championing the adoption of more energy efficient LED lighting bulbs, to banning single-use plastics and imposing extended producer responsibilities on different categories of manufacturers, to setting ambitious targets for renewable and non-fossil fuel energy to the extent of 500 gigawatts by 2030, to committing to reclaim degraded land in excess of 26 million hectares by 2030 and creating additional carbon sinks to the extent of 2.5 to 3 gigatons of carbon by 2030. There are a number of pro-life actions that impact all categories of stakeholders. Actions are also being taken to enhance transparency within the business community, which is often a source of many of the challenges that we see ahead of us. And here, what is sought to be done is to mandate sustainability disclosures via initially the business responsibility and sustainability reports, or the BRSR reports, for the top 1,000 listed companies, and eventually extending that to more companies in the listed space, as well as the value chains of these companies. Anticipated soon is a green taxonomy, an agreed upon classification system of green products and services, which the Ministry of Finance is expected to issue. And what this taxonomy will do will be to really help guide sustainable finance flows to projects that meet the quote unquote green test, including what many of us are hoping for, enhanced flows under a possible recast of the Reserve Bank of India, the Indian Central Bank's definition of priority sector lending. Linked with a green taxonomy, the next level of effort will be around ascribing fair value to natural resources. The International Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, or TNFD, is applying itself to this. And we can soon, I believe, hope to answer with a degree of confidence the age-old question of what is the real value of a tree, or what is the value of a forest, or what is the value of biodiversity, and so on. Now, a green taxonomy and regulatory measures will initially typically influence the behavior of larger businesses. But big challenges should be expected when we turn our attention to the several tens of millions of micro, small, and medium enterprises, the MSMEs, many of which form part of the value chain or the supply chains of larger companies. Around 40% of the actual value add in the economy already takes place within this community. And in many manufacturing sectors, more than 90% of the carbon emissions take place within the supply chain. So addressing the needs of the MSMEs for financing and new non-polluting technology adoption will therefore be critical to achieving the objectives of Mission Life. And given the government status as a large consumer itself, greening government procurement will be one of the levers to persuade smaller businesses in India to hasten the shift to more sustainable practices. The reality in many developing countries like India is that the government has an outsized influence on market developments. It can drive the pace of change faster with a key stakeholder in the green transition, namely the business community. We saw this, for instance, with the migration some years earlier of Indian fuel standards from Bharat Stage 4 to Bharat Stage 6, bypassing Stage 5 over the protests of the Indian auto industry and after a battle that went all the way up to the Supreme Court. We need to also see whether another sector, which has similar implications for broader economic growth, namely construction. By some accounts, around 70% of the construction build-out India needs will take place in the next 2 decades. And we need to see whether construction will also witness government interventions to support more green construction. Yet another sector where the government has outsized influence is clearly agriculture. Successive union budgets and a number of state budgets have demonstrated the intention to transition to sustainable farming, but lots needs to be done to incentivize more environmentally compatible cropping patterns and to diversify production in ways that sustain soil health and without significant groundwater depletion. So as we look ahead, let me pose some questions which the panel may wish to reflect on going forward. The first question relates to the efficiency of existing market mechanisms for trading of sustainability-linked products. Are these fit for purpose to stimulate the creation of new sustainability-linked instruments like carbon credits and bonds to fund nature-based solutions? Can they match demand and supply? Will they permit the vast sums of capital stretching to trillions of dollars for the climate and sustainability transitions to be accessed by India and other developing countries over the next 2 decades? Do we need an international sustainability exchange for developing countries? And full disclosure, at my firm EQ, we actually did some work last year on precisely this idea for an international exchange in Gift City. Next, the intersection of digitization and sustainability allows the possibility of better data-driven insights into the most cost-efficient solutions to accelerate change. So can India, as an acknowledged IT services leader, lead the life transformation by offering technology-driven sustainability solutions that can be scaled and cascaded to the G20 and beyond? And my final question relates to the role that women can play in the economy and in society. Multiple research studies show that women drive more climate and environment-friendly initiatives when they're adequately empowered. So how can we involve women in taking greater charge of the collective destiny of the largest population in the world that India now represents? So these questions on the role of markets, of technology, and of the status of sections of our society, if addressed well, can possibly help us to achieve our life objectives faster. So with those observations, let me conclude and wish you all some very constructive deliberations for the rest of your program. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Rajan, for those insights and also posing some food for thought for the next panel. We are almost on time. I'm not sure if you're still there, but I was going to see if there's time for maybe 1 or 2 questions from the audience for Dr. Rajan. Yes. Any questions from the audience? We may have just a couple of minutes for, okay, I'm being told there isn't time either. So, but with that, let me just thank you once again, Dr. Rajan, for those insights and food for thought. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me.
Round of applause,
Good luck.
Dr. Rajan. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Koyel. Thank you, Mr. Mukund. I will now hand over to Mr. Ajay Shah, co-founder at XKDR Forum, to introduce the first panel of this block. Over to you, Mr. Rajan.
Hello, everyone. I'm grateful to the organizers for having me here today. Let me spend a minute introducing the issues and the questions. Okay, so as a card-carrying economist, I have many illusions about the usefulness of economics in this world. But I will say one thing, that there is one good idea that we economists have to offer on the problems of climate change, and which is the efficacy of carbon taxation. Okay, so there is a grand debate about more central planning type initiatives where a government will specify the fuel efficiency of a car and the energy efficiency of an air conditioner and so on. And that is a less efficient mechanism because officials and politicians and state institutions are not good at understanding the relative opportunities for decarbonizing the economy. Whereas the beauty of a carbon tax is that it reshapes prices, and then a wide variety of economic agents all over the country would think in new ways about how to produce energy and how best to consume energy. So there is no mechanism to get a lower cost climate transition other than a carbon tax. So this is a lot to recommend itself. But the moment you start going down this route, there is the problem of the international ramifications, that if India will have a carbon tax, then carbon intensive businesses will just move to Sri Lanka and so on. So there is the cross-border dimension. And public finance people jumped to a very interesting and powerful analogy going back to 1955. In 1955, the French invented the value-added tax. And the VAT was this beautiful, elegant mechanism to decouple social policy while still having free trade. So one country might like to have a large welfare program, might run a large welfare state, and it might like to have a high level of domestic taxation. There may be other countries that do not have similar expenditure aspirations, but you can still achieve free trade and competition on a global scale by having the twin machinery of a zero rating of exports and the VAT on imports. And this has been done all over the world. In India, we have a GST on imports, and we have a zero rating of exports in the GST. So we can decouple domestic political preferences from the fundamental foundation of international free trade. So that same idea can be applied to the question of carbon, that different countries can choose to play on the carbon transition at different levels of intensity, but we can still protect the fair play of the international trade system by having a system of carbon taxation at the border. Okay, and all this used to be considered arcane theoretical conversations, but it is all moving at breakneck speed, and we are now close to 2026, where the carbon border adjustment mechanism in the European Union will turn into reality. And many people thought, I'm sure you will recognize this, many people thought that, 2026 is very far away. So earlier this year, there was a rude awakening for a lot of people, because there was the requirement that by the 1st of October, exporters of certain products into the EU have to start submitting information statements. So that was like a midterm exam saying, you got to take this seriously and you have to get going building the commensurate information systems. So that's the background and the context in which we meet here in this panel. And once again, I'm very grateful to the organizers for putting this together. This is a very timely subject. This is a very important problem. I'm going to try to rapidly do a few minutes with each of you to elicit your views and arguments, and then we'd love to have some time for conversation. Okay, I'd like to start at Mr. Fakir. Can you tell us your thought process on the implications of border carbon adjustments such as the CBAM for Africa?
So thank you very much, and it's wonderful to do this virtually with my colleagues from Shakti Foundation. We are sister foundations, although we're based in Africa. I wanted to share, I think, sort of insights from a technical report that was just done recently between the ACF and the Feroz Lajli Institute based at the London School of Economics. And we have been trying to observe and make an assessment of the implications of CBAM on the export of carbon-intense goods and services from the continent. And I think the ramifications for Africa cannot be understated. Partly because Europe is a major trading partner of Africa. It's an important trading partner, including China, the US, and so on. But the US has the largest share of trade relations with Africa at the present moment, close to about 200 billion euros of goods or trade relations are entrenched and entangled with the African continent. It does make sense for Europe to have a carbon border tax adjustment, in that it has to phase out emission trading allowances over time and replace it with something. And it's part of the European Green Deal's objective to achieve emission reductions, what they call Fit for 55 by 2030. But what is good for Europe is not necessarily good for the rest of the world. And I think this is the issue and debate that is leading to friction in a context in which the world is moving towards more a fragmented set of trade relations. The protectionism is increasing. And the EU is certainly trying to catch up with China in relationship to the industrialization of green technologies. Particularly, China is the leading country, and particularly China is very important also for Africa in terms of Africa's ability to access cheaper technologies, whether it's electric vehicles, wind, solar, and battery technologies. In fact, I'm putting on my roof at the moment solar PV panels. They procured by a company in London, but actually they're produced in China. And this points to the kind of challenging that you have with, for example, not only with CBAM, but also protectionist measures, that a lot of procurement is actually often by companies that are outside of China, that are using Chinese low-cost production as a way to produce it cheaply, but then deploy it elsewhere in the world. So not all, even though things are produced in China, they are often a result of engineering and other technical expertise that comes out of China. For example, your iPhones are produced by Apple, but the specifications are done by engineers in Apple. So I think for the CBAM to succeed, it cannot only be just applied to the European jurisdiction. In fact, the problem of carbon leakage will increase if other countries do not apply similar rules and mechanisms within their own borders, in order to be able to reinforce the idea of a universal global carbon price and a carbon tax on all goods and services that are produced in different countries. The strategic imperative for Europe is very clear. It wants to maintain its competitive advantage under the rubric of reducing carbon emissions. At the same time, being able to curtail competition from other competing countries in the same technology space. For Africa, the ramifications are far more severe, because there is no waiver, although the EU has pointed out that any revenues that are generated from the carbon tax will be utilized to support low-income countries, or LDCs. This is still something that the details of which will have to be quite clear. But for now, at least from the study that we see, that 26% of fertilizers that are exported to Europe, 11% of iron and steel, 12% of aluminium, and 12% of cement are industries that will be severely affected by what I would say a blunt and not very well thought through instrument, maybe well thought through in Europe, but not well thought through for implications for European partners, especially on the continent that is only 13 kilometers away from Europe. In our view, it is not prudent to exert and impose a blunt instrument without some level of consideration of your proximate trade partner, although it might not be the major one, on which you are in future looking to derive resources that are crucial for the scaling up of certainly the technologies that you're looking to use to achieve decarbonization targets within the European Union. One of them is, of course, critical minerals, and there are many others. The second part is also on a continent which, on one hand, you are sort of using a blunt instrument that affects their economies, and potentially up to 1% of Africa's GDP, and annually around 25 billion euros. You are not providing other forms of concessions to support a set of relationships that allow for, in one hand, good neighborliness, positive trade, constructive trade relationships, and secondly, concessions that assist Africans to be able to embark on some form of economic resilience, and also be able to have recourse to means for implementing transitions, particularly in those countries that are the most affected. And those countries would be at present South Africa, Morocco, Nigeria, Egypt, the major carbon intense economies. So in summary, I think EU is not aligning itself with the Paris Agreement in terms of common but differentiated responsibilities. It is speeding ahead with an ill thought through form of tax that is good in principle, but not good in terms of the impact it will have on countries that are likely to be severely affected by this instrument. And it could be also in violation of the World Trade Organization, and that's still to be seen. So I just wanted to sort of be provocative and put this out there.
Yeah, thanks. Do you have an opinion? Do you have an opinion on what governments in Africa are likely to do in practice, starting from around now? Because by default, many exporters have to gear up to meet the October deadline.
So I can only speak of two countries that I know of, particularly South Africa is beginning to, it has, for example, the National Treasury has worked on carbon border tax adjustment for many years. But we have certainly engagements with the Trade and Industrial Ministry on trying, the South African government is trying to develop a position internally within South Africa. It is certainly looking at, it has not, in my view yet, developed a strong position with the BRICS and certainly within the G20, and let alone broader African constituencies. But I think that will start to emerge very rapidly. We do know that, for example, the African group of negotiators are interested in taking up this issue because of concerns about whether it's Paris aligned or not. And we will start to see emergence of positions beginning to develop. I think particularly within the context of the BRICS arrangement, particularly in relationship to India and China, who are now becoming far more activist about how to deal with CBAM. And that will definitely draw Africa into the ambit of discussions as we go forward.
Thanks, Salim. Can I turn to you, Suranjali? What is the state of taxation of carbon in India? While we have not used the explicit term a carbon tax, there is a significant burden of taxation on coal, on petroleum products. Do you have a sense of that landscape of what are these taxes and what kind of values do they add up to?
Thanks, Ajay. That's a very relevant question. I think that's what everyone asks when economists such as myself argue for a carbon tax. At the moment, there are multiple taxes that are applicable if you look at different fossil fuels. So, for example, coal will have its own set of taxes, which is like royalties. You'll have GST. On fuel, we've seen that there's been some rigidity in terms of taxes not declining when prices cool off or prices go up. And we've seen the fuel taxes account for a significant proportion of India's collections. So we have excise, which would be levied at the state level on petroleum. You would have other kinds of ad valorem taxes as well as cesses, which are applicable. So at the moment, there are multiple taxes. There are also district level taxes. So for example, there is contribution from coal and other mining to district mineral funds. And if you look at how it compares to the propositions of having a carbon tax, so for example, we were just looking at the effective rates. I'm still in the process of finalizing that, but looking at effective rates on each of the fossil fuels, and they don't even come up to $10 per ton of CO2. And the recommendations that you often hear at the IMF is that 25 to 30, which is also something the RBI wrote about in its recent report. But $25 to $30 is actually quite a bit, so requires us to think about how to design this carbon tax in the future. Of course, at the moment, the thinking around having a carbon tax is rather shallow in India, so we haven't really proceeded on articulating it because of all these effects that the rates will go up. It will put inflationary pressure. There'll be distributional consequences, and there are going to be questions that you're doing so much on fossil fuels already. So where's the scope to ratchet it up?
When you come to October 2023 and the measurement and tracking of information about the comprehensive carbon content of a ton of steel, what is your sense of these information systems in India, and what are your thoughts for how these things can be done better?
Thanks, Ajay. We have someone from Tata Steel here. I think will be able to tell us more how companies think about it. But my sense is that today there are a lot of companies that are internally pricing carbon. And when they do that, they have an internally established process of tracking their carbon emissions. Now, at 2023, it's also going to be an intergovernmental issue. So there will be firms which will have to align themselves to the CBAM, acquire these certificates. And of course, the Indian government's concern would be the backward impact on trade. So I think at one level, other companies also within the value chain. So you would also have a lot of SMEs within the value chain of these large companies who would also have to track. So that would be one concern. The other is for the government itself to know, what are the kind of emissions associated with different industries, so as to be to anticipate what will be the forward-looking impacts of the CBAM. At the moment, I believe that there are sectors where we look at only large firms, and these sectors are concentrated. So, for example, iron and steel would have a few big companies, and to that extent, my sense is that there would be preparedness because they've existed in markets abroad. But insofar as the entire value chain is concerned, other sectors are concerned, I would say that it would require significant rejigging. And I think the government would also have to pull up its socks and figure out what's the mechanism for at least its own understanding of forward-looking impact on these sectors, the tax.
Thanks, Suranjali. So I'm thinking that in the long arc of the evolution of Indian fiscal policy, just like concepts like GST first came out of the intellectual community and then moved into the real world, I think in similar fashion, you have your work cut out for you. Yes, Suranjali, you have to write lots of things on this subject and build knowledge. I'll come. Sure. Yes, please.
What Suranjali just said. Suranjali, in fact, when you talk about the carbon border adjustment measure, it is not just the taxes that you mentioned, that even the RBI report talks about, but also the fact that there is a price on the type of fuel that is used in the form of, say, the renewable energy certificates, which is linked to the renewable purchase obligation. So the electricity that anyone takes from the grid or even a captive plant will need to account for a certain component of clean energy whose pricing is different. The second component is relating to the steel and the aluminum sectors, even in India, which are treated as energy intensive sectors, which have to adhere to specific energy consumption targets, related to which there are the energy saving certificates. My point is that indirect electricity is all, or indirect emissions is also a part of accounting for. That is something which, when you said the complexity of factoring and pricing, that carbon is not free in India. We may not have perfected it in the nature of a tax. Even EU doesn't have a tax. EU has a charge. And our charges are manifested not only in the fuel price or the coal cess, but also in these regulatory measures, which is RPO and REC and the energy savings related certificates.
You're right, and it's an important distinction. Just for clarity, my understanding is that in the European Union, there is a market for carbon certificates, and that discovers the price. So the idea is that as the regulatory measures come in, they will turn into that shadow price. So it can be made to coexist, that there can be an explicit tax on carbon, there can be regulatory measures. As I said right at the outset, the economists will argue that the cost of the adjustment for society will always be lower if it's an explicit carbon tax and not a regulatory measure. But how these pieces will work with India, it's a fair question. It's an interesting and important question. And may I come to you on my next group of questions? What are your thoughts on frictions between border carbon adjustment and WTO obligations? Do you think that the openness that is required out of the WTO is consistent with carbon taxation as is being built in the European Union?
Thanks. Let me actually start with, at the WTO, when it comes to the concept of differentiating between products based on embedded emissions, which is exactly what the carbon border adjustment mechanism of EU is trying to do. And as you explained, the fear is carbon leakage, so therefore they want to equalize based on the price that is being paid in the EU. So as far as the WTO is concerned, current jurisprudence, the way it has been interpreted, and the letter of the law, the way it is drafted, does not allow for differentiation based on the product and process methods or the embedded emissions which are not manifested in the physical characteristics of a product. So, a car coming in or getting imported into the EU is similar to a car being produced in the EU, irrespective of the charges that are being placed at the point of production. So from that perspective, a WTO challenge to this will certainly lead to a striking down of the EU measure. Having said that, the WTO dispute settlement mechanism currently is dysfunctional. WTO is a beleaguered institution when we are still uncertain about the future of this institution. What I would like to, however, link this whole debate is with the completely the dichotomy between rulemaking and in international environmental law. You'd made a comment, Mr. Shah, in the beginning, that there are different countries have different targets, and the entire mechanism of international environmental law, the UNFCCC, works on the concept of nationally determined contributions, which is fundamentally linked to the way it has been negotiated. There was a mention by Salim earlier about common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities, which essentially acknowledges that industrialization has occurred and occupied the carbon space by developed countries. And countries like ours, sure enough, we can't follow the same path to industrialization. We need to follow a more sustainable path. That's a given. But in achieving that path, the obligations are structured in a way which say that we have a longer time, a longer leeway to achieve our net zero target, which is 2070, whereas for EU, the net zero target is 2050. Now, at the point when countries are having differential targets, which is internationally negotiated, internationally honored, internationally recognized, and then to say that to enter my country as a trade product, however, you have to pay this to equalize my price so that my industry remains competitive enough. There is fundamentally something which is unlawful about that in terms of basic principles. If, for example, Tata Steel or Hindalco or anyone has to pay a higher amount, why not pay it in India then? So why not have that amount paid in India, which goes to the Indian revenues for achieving our sustainability targets? Let me just complete one more point.
Can I just? Does this work? Yeah. So the calculation of the carbon border tax is supposed to offset the domestic carbon taxes. So, potentially what I was asking Suranjali is to take the existing system that is prevalent in India and set up the commensurate information systems, and then that problem would be addressed.
It may not equalize, and that's, I think, what I would actually leave to Ajay to talk about. He's done excellent, analysis of this in terms of whatever even if you were to arrive at a way. I think we are still a little way away from there, and it will be good to know if Tata Steel or any of the other companies have actually come up with the what is the inherent carbon price that is being paid in India. You're right, that will be offset, but we will never be able to equalize. There will be a certain component, and in terms of figures that have been thrown out there, there could be as much as something like 50 euro per ton of carbon dioxide, which may need to be paid at the EU border to the EU entities. The only dichotomy I wanted to complete in terms of thought process is, again, you know that developed countries had pledged way back in 2009 that there is a target of $100 trillion by 2020, which will have to be paid towards climate financing by 2020. 2023, we are far away from it. Just a few days back, there was this study in Nature Sustainability Journal, which talked about if you were to look at pure equity, there has to be a payment of 1,500 euro per capita to a country like India from developed countries. Instead of that happening, we are really looking at a situation where a CBAM will act as a reverse financing by Indian companies to the EU revenues. And that's the problem that I have with this. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I will. No, in order, please. Ajay, can I please come to you? Your recent report of the GTRI had interesting and important knowledge on this. Tell us how border carbon adjustments will reshape international trade and production, and how best can LMIC play this new emerging environment?
Nice. So let's have a peep into the future. It's all hypothetical, but my thinking goes like this. So today, only 6 products, they are charging carbon tax: steel, hydrogen, aluminum, cement, and others, fertilizers, others. But by 2034, EU has declared all products. None will be left. All will be covered. And today, their average duty on industrial product is 2%. This tax comes around 20 to 35% on an average. For cement, I have calculated, so it goes above 90%. Okay. So very high tax. Now, what will happen to the world trade? Today, EU's global imports are about $4 or $5 trillion. On an average, even if 10% tax is charged, then it will be sufficient to meet their budgetary requirement. So I see them using this measure to meet their budgetary requirements. Now, what will happen to the global trade? So EU is not alone. UK has announced its plan to introduce this. USA is also talking on similar lines. Canada, Japan also have expressed their intention. So we say about half the world, that is half the world trade, I mean, all the developed world may be introducing carbon type of tax in next 2-3 years. They're all talking to each other. They're in sync. Okay. So what will happen to the world trade? Let's think. My guess will be as right or wrong as yours. But this is my guess. So whole of the world will be divided into 2 parts. CBAM plus countries who are charging tax and those who are not charging tax, CBAM neutral countries. Now, suppose, now Tata Steel. Now, suppose they invest into green hydrogen and make totally green, 100% green steel, it will be expensive. The steel price will be at least 2 times in the normal steel price. They can happily send to Europe. And why do you think, what will happen to their market in Latin America or Africa, which does not charge this tax? Will they accept expensive steel? No. So do you think Tata Steel will be maintaining 2 sets of production facilities in their premises? That's a distinct reality. Not everybody will be able to do that. So number one, so the trade will be divided into these 2 parts. Now, this is what will happen to many countries like India or China. Then second, what I say, in India, I am exporting to European countries and to African and non-CBAM other countries. But EU exporters have to use only EU products. And all their products will be expensive because they have already paid this tax. What will happen to their exports to, say, African countries who don't charge it? Of course, they'll be outpriced. So EU exporters, they will see a distinct reduction in their exports. I don't know whether they have factored this out or not. And you will see, the surprise may be thrown by China. Most of the developed world, including say US or EU, basically they're working, thinking on green energy is like this. We make green hydrogen if we can through solar and wind, and then make green steel and blah blah blah. What China is doing, China is doing all these things, but they're investing most into hydroelectric. They are talking of making green hydrogen from hydroelectric. The cost is 1/3 compared to what's made if it's made from wind or solar. So Chinese steel, totally green steel, it will go to, I mean, it's a distinct possibility, it will go to EU and American market, will outplace their domestic manufacturers. So, I mean, immense permutations and combinations are possible, and they're all commonsensical.
Yep.
I'm not stretching my imaginations. So we have to get up and learn every day will be a new day for learning.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. No, everything you say is very sound. Going from a carbon emitting world to a zero carbon world is a giant change in the structure of production. The technologies that are used, the products that are consumed, everything has to change. So, I mean, nobody should have any illusions that there is an easy path there to there. The question is, what is a cost minimizing path to there? And we are all in the story of deciphering the ways to get that done at the lowest welfare implications. Okay, finally, I turn to you, Mr. Chowdhury. You are in the eye of the storm. What is your state of capability on creating the information systems to be ready for October? Curious, if the European CBAM came about tomorrow, what would it do to the prices of steel made by you and made by other rivals, and the competitive dynamics in the European markets? And what is your medium-term journey about the role of carbon in the steel industry? As all of us know, there are two parts to this. One is the purchase of electricity, which can more readily go renewable, and the other is the elimination of coal in the very production process. So give us your sense of the path to zero carbon Tata Steel.
Okay.
By the way, will it still be called carbon steel when there's no carbon in
No,
it?
we'll call it low carbon steel or minimum carbon steel. I hope I'm audible.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Good. Finally, I got an opportunity to say a few things. But first, I will respond to some of the things I heard in between. So one is obviously Europe is looking at more of hard to abate sector, which you, Ajay, just mentioned, which is a fact that, and this journey has been on. So I don't know whether people should suddenly say why this and why that. But I would like to step back and tell what is happening around the world. We, about a decade back, we all were moving towards multi-country agreements, multi-region agreements from a bilateral kind of a thing. A lot of work was happening government to government on those. And then if you go 5 years back, those have stepped aside and it is all about bilaterals. What has happened is that every economy, which we used to say, the world is one and we should have level playing field all across, is not a reality today. US does not allow most of the products to go from outside. They have huge amount of duties, anti-dumping duties, you call them, it's there. NTBs, NTBs, whatever you want to say. Coming to Europe, surely, and I'll take examples from steel because that's what we understand and we look at. So they've been working very, very strongly within Europe to reduce carbon footprint for hard to abate sectors. We, in some way, have a real-time sense because we run a plant there in Netherlands. We have a plant in UK and balances in India. So we know exactly what the government is doing, and every stakeholder has a stake in it. So it's not that government is pushing something to ensure that outsiders pay, that if I go from India, I will pay for their extra money that they are spending or spend. I don't think that's a fact. What they have done is they have said there is some funds to support the industry to decarbonize. And that fund, as they call it, as a free allowances for carbon emissions, will be available till a particular point in time. Per million ton of steel that you produce, they give you some fund. And that is what they will start reducing from now till 2026. The reason they give you those free allowances is that you start reducing your carbon footprint. Now, Could be through, we heard about hydrogen, it could be storage and stuff like that. And then they have a set of customers who have signed up. Pardon? Thank you. Yeah. So they have had set of customers who've signed up to take that low carbon steel at a higher price. Cost curve of Europe has to be understood vis-a-vis our own country. And even if we don't do anything in India, which I will talk about, we will still be able to sell, taking that CBAM into account, because the cost of production in India will be much lower than what Ajay was saying over there, and you'll still have some profits to make even if you don't do anything. The second is, everything in Europe is not converting under CBAM or converting into this incentivization. In steel, less than 50% steel is actually getting committed to that. Some of it is already electric arc furnace route, so it is low in carbon footprint. But as per our understanding terms, only 50% of steel which is getting produced today will get converted into this incentivized low carbon steel. The balance will still pay out that penalty and sell whether in Europe or outside. I'll just take a few minutes to tell about India's story and what we are doing. And I think you referred to it in some way that in India, we already pay out some taxes, cess, which are not headlined under carbon emission tax or whatever, clean energy tax on coal and stuff like that. We've been engaging with the government. We means the industry has been engaging with the government to at least decide and come under one heading saying this is what the industry already pays and can be shown as an incentive or disincentive so that we don't pay out everything. So that's one. Government of India and Ministry of Steel, Government of India has formed some 13 task forces to move steel to a low carbon industry. Each of these task forces is actually working on each of these elements to ensure that we are able to move in that direction. The third, and I will answer that question as well, that there is not only production processes, it's also about scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions. So it's supposed to be an end-to-end game. And third is what you just rightly mentioned, every country has a differential target. 2070, Tata Group has 2045, someone has 2050. We are all moving in that direction. And frankly speaking, we don't need to look at what Europe will clamp on us or not clamp on us. We should have our own journey. But I'm sure that the journey that India is taking and steel sector, because hard to abate sector in India, we are surely governed in terms of, or we are on the path to ensure that we reach our targets much in advance, and we will not get actually penalized by what Europe is doing for its own good. Last point I would like to mention here is that the way India is poised today, and it's not steel only, we are a growing economy. If I look at steel only, in the next 10 years, we don't see steel growing except for Africa or India or a part of Asia. So the growth will have domestic ramification as well. We are now positioning India as manufactured in India for the world. And I think most of the consumptions will happen in India, but it's for our own good that we start reducing our path of carbon emissions for India itself. So I'll just end here.
Thank you.
Telling me to stop.
Okay, now we turn to Maria Scopio. You have doubtless thought a lot about these questions, and you've just heard 5 different points of view. So could you please give us your thoughts and responses on how you see these same things?
Yes, good. Thank you very much. Good morning from Brussels. Here is morning. And it was very interesting to hear to the contributions of the different speakers. What I can say is that we have developed CBAM having in mind environmental measure. We would like to treat goods that are imported in the European Union as if they were produced in the European Union. As you know, we have been terribly ambitious and maybe forthcoming with our ETS, but we needed to be even more ambitious by eliminating the free allocations that our companies have been using since the ETS establishment. To do so, we needed also to consider the possibility of carbon leakage, meaning going to establish in another third country where these ambitious measures are not existing. So we decided to have in Europe the same level of ambitions for all the goods that are imported in the sectors that are considered. We don't see it, therefore, not at all as a protectionist measure, because in fact, everyone is put on the same level. Our industries are on the same level as the ones that are exporting to the European Union. We consider that a successful CBAM is a CBAM that would kill itself, that would not exist anymore. Because we believe that it would be important to start a global discussion on climate. And we see in India a very good counterpart to have this kind of dialogue. There is more and more the conscience of the fact that we only have one planet, and that is degrading very soon. So the fact that CBAM directly takes into account the emissions that are produced in the production of those goods, and that allows for the taking into account of measures that have already been applied in terms of price of carbon in the origin country, is an incentive to green the production of industry and to discuss about the same level playing field in terms of institutional measures for countries. So I have to say that our first interlocutors are the industries, because they are the ones that will have to report on CBAM. I have heard many concerns, of course, not only from your country, but also from the colleagues of the representing Africa. And of course, there will be an impact. But first of all, let me put this impact in perspective. The first 3 years, starting on the 1st of October this year, will only be theoretical, because we are only going to request a declaration, no adjustment at the border, no payment. Thus, this kind of activity will help us to gather all the necessary information to come ready for the definitive phase of CBAM, which is supposed to start on the 1st of January 2026. By then, we will know what are the fluxes, what are the measures that have been taken into account in the meantime. And moreover, CBAM will not be applicable 100% from the beginning. As we said, CBAM is done to reflect the elimination of free allowances. Therefore, there is a roadmap to eliminate these free allowances gradually inside Europe, and CBAM will enter into force gradually as well. We are only foreseeing a full application of CBAM in 2034, which is more than 10 years. And in more than 10 years, we think that a lot can be done. A lot can be done in order to take into account the price of carbon globally. And there are many ways to do that. One of these is, for instance, the fact that I am here today. But also this is part of an outreach campaign that will lead us to help importer, exporter, to discuss with governments, with industry. We are going to try to set up a global dialogue that will try to put us all on the same understanding of what we are trying to fight, which is climate change. CBAM is not the only measure to do so. As you know, we have the ambitious plan to be neutral in carbon terms in 2050. And this is accompanied also by other measures that we have applied in different areas. I am particularly in charge of CBAM because although it is not a tax, the role of customs can be crucial in order to apply it and control it. So I think it's also early days to have an informed discussion about it. We still have to publish our implementing rules that will give additional elements on how to calculate carbon emissions, so what will be the administrative burden. So I can only reassure those that have spoken and say that, in fact, what we see as more problematic is the impact on our own exporters. It's not really a protectionist measure in that respect, because they will have to compete with trade in the rest of the world, which is not subject to ETS and not subject to CBAM in terms of application at the border. So we are actually starting with us We are starting to apply this first. We try to lead by example in a way. For what concerns the fact that it will be important to verify its impact, we are totally on the same line. We again are listening. We listen not only to those that will report to us during the transitional period, but we are listening already now. We are having bilateral discussions also with India, but also with a lot of other countries. That's basically our main activity at the moment. Those implementing regulation will be subject to a public consultation. They will be public in the next days, and they will be subject to consultation by basically all the stakeholders. So we are really trying to do whatever we can in order to, first of all, make our partners understand what is the intention of Europe behind this measure, which is not masochistic nor sadistic, meaning to speak in psychological terms, we just try to push for a global understanding of fighting climate change. Second, we try to help to deal with the impact by understanding what that would mean in practice for our exporters, for our importers, for countries that are dealing with it at the moment, and for industries that are established elsewhere. And third, we are happy to keep having dialogues in all possible forms, and also the international organizations are very important in that respect. There are a lot of parallel initiatives in terms of climate discussions in the UN, in the OECD, there are the COP. It's possible to keep having this debate and this discussion. And this is not for tomorrow, again. This is in preparation of what CBAM will be in some time. So I would not like to dwell too much on the foreseeable impacts, because we want to first see it work in theory. And then we will come with an informed opinion of what CBAM can mean in practice, either from an administrative burden point of view, but also from an emission burden point of view, because we will be able to check, although in theory, what would be the amount of CBAM certificates that would be needed at the border, plus what could be the impact of the national measures that could be taken into account to reduce this burden. I understand that I'm not replying to all the different aspects that have been raised, but I do it on purpose. I do it on purpose because we are really trying to get all our data in place before we can come to conclusions, and I hope you will understand that.
Thank you very much to all the panelists. The organizers have given me the tough task of closing this by 2:35, and I'm already at 2:46. I just want to say that there is so much in this landscape that needs to be understood and discussed. And it's a huge field of inquiry at the intersection of climate, of the industrial and economic transformation that is required for decarbonizing the economy and international trade. So I think a huge amount of work and knowledge building and thinking and conversation along with the industry needs to be undertaken by the Indian research community, and all of us in this room, we should put our shoulders to this task. So with this, I'll bring the session to a close. Thank you.
Thank you, Ajay, and all the speakers. May I please invite Manu Maudgal, Head of Corporate and Philanthropic Engagement at Shakti Foundation, to lead us to the next panel discussion on enabling lifestyles for environment, accelerating green trade and investments.
I think that was quite a session. We had a house full practically. And while some of us kind of take a break, I think it's very important that we kind of proceed and chug along. And with this, it's my honor to kind of start off the second panel discussion for the day, which is on accelerating trade and investments using life as a lens. I'll quickly move to a short introduction to what the panel is all about. It's on accelerating investments. And to paint a context, throughout the day today, what we have learned is that the challenge of global warming is more closer than we actually anticipated. The 1.5 degrees Celsius breaching of the barrier is probably going to happen in the next 5 years, as per the World Meteorological Organization, comparative to what we thought might be like the year 2100. So it's actually going to happen within our own respective lifetimes rather than something way down like 2070 and beyond. So what it actually means is that we don't have much time to lose. We need to kind of put our best foot forward and mount both a survival response and I will also say a mitigation response going forward. In the presidency of India's G20, which I can say is also part of a larger block of the global South leading the G20 over the starting with Indonesia last year and going forward even for the next 2 years with South Africa as well as Brazil. So I think what this gives us is a good opportunity to actually examine into the larger issues of how the global South and the global North can kind of trudge along, march along, probably collaborate and partner in this fight and a larger goal for overall mitigation as well as growth as well as livelihoods. India's presidency, as we all know, has the larger theme, which is guided by the age-old Indian principle of Vasudev Kutumbakam, which translates into one earth, one family, one future. The Prime Minister has further added to this by laying down the LIFE concept, which stands for Lifestyle for Environment, which Dr. Mukund Rajan, by the way, very nicely elucidated today in his keynote address. And I think our panel can actually take inspiration and guidance from some of the elements which he kind of portrayed across. I certainly will, in terms of the kind of questions I will kind of nudge some of the panelists on. I think what we really sort of can then conclude is in terms of what the G20 can take as inputs from this very panel in terms of what really needs to be done if the lifestyle for environment has to be integrated for larger acceleration of trade and investments. With this, I will actually want to begin the panel discussion with a question to Diksha, who is joining us online. Diksha represents Aditya Birla Group, but more than that, I think she is working in the aluminum industry at a much, I would say, we're having a very holistic international view on how trade and investments are flowing. Diksha, what do you think are the tipping points you foresee for accelerating the green investments from an industry lens and not necessarily only an Aditya Birla lens?
Thank you, Manu, and thank you for having me here. It's also quite interesting that I have many old and new friends on this panel, which is always nice. So hello to the panelists. Prabha, good to see you there, and also Manu. And Manu, maybe I'll just go to what you know when I was thinking of how we talk here today, and also looking at life and then the publication that they had of 75 ideas for World Environment Day. And it's quite interesting the kind of enablers and levers that have come through when use of that context that, how do we move from mindless consumption to mindful utilization. I quite like the prayas se prabhav that, how do we move from the actions to impact. I thought that was quite powerful. And then the key levers that are being talked about under life. And I think those are the ones that are going to come into play as we continue to move ahead in a world with the kind of trends that we are facing. How do you kind of balance out the previous panel on what they spoke about, how Europe is talking about CBAM and all the other countries joining in, versus with the manufacturing moving more and more, has having moved to Asia, where the largest number of people live as well. To strike that balance between the two and saying that the transition needs to be just is how we'll have to navigate and find the route that, how do we live with first is not relying on saying that transition needs to be just, so the countries like India making their own efforts in terms of, say, what I talk about, that the SDG 12, that getting that balance between responsible consumption and responsible production, but also finding those areas of, and circular economy is one such one such important lever, especially when we talk about, say, for aluminium industry in a geography like India, where for an energy intensive industry, and the fuel being available, for some time to come, we would be relying on browner fuels till we are able to sort the issue of getting round the clock power for industry like that. Therefore, use of circular economy as a lever to reduce the carbon footprint, to have the resource availability or resource security, and continuing to move ahead in terms of growing or having ability to trade as these restrictions come along. I think that's where I would leave it, that to be able to find those sweet spots. Thank you.
I think you've actually laid the entire slate of what really needs to be done from an industry lens. But I think what McKinsey recently did is, in terms of releasing a report on decarbonizing India. But what I really want to quickly go back to, in terms of also building further on Diksha's list of asks, is what do you think is, from your report, is the template of growth which not only India, but probably the G20 and what the wider world can look at?
Thanks, Manu. I think it's a very relevant and interesting question. Before I get to the report, I think just taking the theme of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which I think our Indian Prime Minister has laid out, I think it's a very relevant problem for very relevant concept for this problem, because sustainability is probably one of the biggest challenges humankind has faced, right? And it's a really global problem. If somebody plays foul, everybody is going to get impacted. So it's not that, somebody can decarbonize, but somebody is left behind. That's not going to solve the problem at the end of the day. In fact, as per our analysis, Global South contributes to, or will contribute, 2/3 of the emissions going forward, but it does not have the resources today to decarbonize, right? And decarbonize in a way in which it delivers equitable growth for the nations. So I think if I turn back to how this problem manifests in India, when we did the report, I think there were a few insights which are relevant for this group, and then I will bring it together on what can be done to your question, right? So I think 2-3 things which we noted about India in particular, which is very interesting and relevant for many global South economies. 3 Indias will be built between now and 2050. The India we see today, 3 times that we will have by 2050. So we have a unique opportunity that we are not replacing capacities. We are building capacities, and that means we can build them right, if we choose to. So the question is, how do we build them right? The issue, and by the way, when we do that, the benefits are enormous for the country, right? We will reduce our energy import bill significantly, close to $2 trillion by 2050. We will make sure that we have manufacturing capability for the world, right? From a green manufacturing perspective, all those are very important for sustainable growth of the nation. However, the issue is that as we sit now, this is not a 2040 problem. This is not a 2050 problem. This is a problem now. Because today, when we are making capital decisions, every day when we are making capital decisions sitting in the boardroom, and I'm part of many of those decision-making processes for my clients, the issue is the economics. If it's not working today, you are going to get capacities which are brown capacities, and they are going to lock you in, right? For foreseeable future. It will be very hard to decarbonize going forward. So the question is, how can this Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam concept come, where the global north and global south work together, where global south gets the desired help to decarbonize, right? And that can happen primarily through finances, right? Finances and technology flow is what is needed to make it happen. But it's not a straight ask that, hey, global north, give us $100 trillion and we will solve the problem. That's not how this is going to work. I think in our view, this problem needs to be broken down into bite-sized chunks, which can drive decisions in the boardrooms. So I'll give you an example. Let's say if you have a solution today, you want to build a pumped hydro project in Maharashtra, right? The question is, the IRR of that or the rate of return of that project is quite feasible today itself. The issue is that if you then couple that with a country risk of India, some policy risks which can happen, currency risk because the money is going to come from US and global north countries, you suddenly expect an IRR of 15-20% rather than 8 or 9%. A pumped hydro project can't deliver a 15-20% IRR. So you will not get investments. This project is not investable today. So what can be done to get those projects which will help decarbonize the country and make them investable by getting right financial structures enabled, in which there is a mix of concessional capital, currency swap arrangements, bilateral, agreements and things like that, which can help you make some of these projects investable and get the private capital, right? Private capital needed to decarbonize, because this is not a public capital problem. That will not solve the problem. We have to make the economics work. That's the fundamental truth on how this can happen. And that's where global south and global north can collaborate together in making that happen.
I think very impressive. 3 Indias will be built by 2050. Ashok, I think your task is actually cut out at the National Investment and Infrastructure Fund. But I think just going back to what Prabha mentioned, that the problem is here and now, and the government of India has already created your entity. Can you kind of illustrate what kind of plans you have ahead and how the wider community, the global community, can kind of leverage this to enable flows of investments?
Thank you. Thank you, Manu, and thank you, organizers, for inviting me. And thanks, Prabha, for putting this in context. The thing is, like, the NIF is basically institutional investor which has been set up by Government of India, and we are a platform which has been created with government as well as international institutional investors. And the beauty is, like, we are allowed to look at these issues which have been flagged here from a lens of in terms of developing it and providing the solutions which we can take up. So I will take in terms of the partnership which needs to be brought in. It is all about the partnership, and I need to emphasize that the projects which are locally required, right, in terms of be it manufacturing or infrastructure, the partnership is only going to help, and the resources which are required can only be brought through the institutional investors as well as private equity, which is playing a major role. I will take an example where we have set up the climate fund, right, through our one of the funds, and this is in collaboration with UK's FCDO and NIF. Both together they have put in, and this climate fund, as we are discussing on many of the projects which are taken up across the country in renewable energy, in decarbonizing the economy, and decarbonization projects which have been set up. So renewable energy is one. The other one is on waste and wastewater management, which is taken up along the Ganges. Along the Ganges, we have set up this project through our portfolio fund, and also like e-mobility, which is another important issue which we are grappling with, and the mass transits which are to be looked at. So I want to bring to the notice of everyone that by bringing the projects at the local level with the help of the required finances, which are otherwise not available, right? In terms of the bilateral fundings which are happening, and right projects can be looked at. And this is one, like through this platform, we are able to establish the projects and deliver to the decarbonization agenda.
So certainly the institutional response is in place, and you are actually acted in the way kind of what you mentioned in terms of bite-sized responses. You see relevance for this platform even for other countries, other regions?
Yeah, basically like in third world economies and
Can they kind of leverage it?
Yeah, it can be certainly like taken up, and many of the projects can be in partnership. That's the need actually, like the PPP mode, which was there earlier, can be revived, and many of the solutions can be provided through this mechanism. And we believe new technologies which are coming in, especially like your plant-based meats and other technologies which are being in testing phase, those needs to be supported by all of us in that domain in order to achieve our objective of decarbonizing the economy.
Right. So Akshay, I think I'll come to you now in terms of the larger context of partnerships which Ashok has kind of painted. For example, he mentioned the Indo-UK climate program, that FCDO program that you're running. But I think there is a need for many, many more, which I think the McKinsey report has already pointed out. In your experience, what kind of frameworks, what kind of policy nudges do you think countries need to take? Do they need to take it individually? Do they need to take it collectively? Any thoughts and your experience on this?
Thanks a lot, and thanks again for having invited me over here. Just to make a point of clarification, I'm still a partner with Trilegal in addition to being having just founded TrustBridge. But to come to your question, I think there are two parts to it. Let me just divide it up into partnerships on the one hand and policy nudges on the other. I think a very important area that we need to be thinking of, and it's not something that's going to happen overnight. There needs to be a trajectory to it, which was a subject that was underlying the last panel, and that's the point of a carbon tax. I think that not only in terms of India needs a price for carbon at some point for our own internal reasons, but we also need it in order to be able to be most efficient in dealing with things like a CBAM. And I'll leave the debate about whether it's a good thing or not. That's something that was in the previous session. But a carbon tax and to telescope or cascade the various different types of taxes that we already have on various aspects of carbon emissions in the country into a single identifiable tax will both change people's behaviors as well as give us a lot of leeway to deal with international issues relating to carbon prices. And I think I'm not an economist, but my economist friends tell me that there are ways in which to make this GST neutral so that we are not necessarily putting a greater burden on the Indian consumer, which is ultimately a big consideration for us. That's one. I think building on the idea that Ashok talked about in terms of these bilateral funds or multilateral funds, I think a really important area that needs to be looked at carefully is the area of payment security. We looked at a payment security fund with the World Bank some years ago, which was going to cover the first loss of lenders in a situation where there was a payment default by a state discom on a solar project. Now, it is interesting, for those people who deal with these issues, there's an instant question of moral hazard, which is if there is someone else who's going to pay out for you, why would a discom do it? But the way that was designed was to deal with that issue of moral hazard by saying that you get kicked off this program, the access to this fund, in the event that there's even one default. Your first default will be paid, but after that, you'll be kicked off the fund. Credit ratings will go down and various other things that can be brought into place. Something similar is being thought of at the moment in relation to the e-mobility project as well. And I think this type of credit enhancement, and this goes to Prabhav's point about how do you improve investability. And as someone who's represented investors for a number of years, that's the only lens at which I look at this. Yes, of course, we need to look at sustainability, but how will an investor respond to a certain mechanism? So one way to reduce or to be able to bump up the IRR of that project that Prabha was talking about was to provide credible payment security. And I think we haven't focused deeply enough on it. And this is something in which there needs to be partnership, and coming back to the theme of partnership between state governments, the central government, and international bodies. And I think if we talk about the transition funding and the 100 billion that is always spoken of, again, Prabhav's point was very apt that we can't just expect the money to flow. But if we design transition programs, say the implementation of a carbon tax, and say this X is going to be the price for that implementation over a certain number of years, then conversations can start internationally about how some of those, the costs of that transition can be borne by the commitment that developed countries have and must have in relation to the whole climate transition. So I'll stop there and happy to come back.
Thanks, Akshay, especially for painting out the binary of partnerships and policy nudges together, which actually kind of segues into the, I would say, convergence that Dr. Simrit Kaur brings with a very noted economic public policy background, and of course, her ability to now also nudge the future through the young generations that she's training to take charge of trade and investments. So my question to you, and in fact want to learn from your experience on this one, is that there has been, as you can see from the panel, a need for change. And this change requires both, I would say, public policy inputs as well as new partnerships. In terms of public policy inputs, how do you see India's response as of now? And how maybe we can kind of learn either from the wider responses from other countries, imbibe them, or also kind of contribute back to the larger, I would say, frameworks of change which need to be established?
Thank you so much. Climate change per se is a very pertinent topic, and unfortunately, whatever amount of work is required globally, we are nowhere working on it, including the finance part of it. Largely, we've seen that we discuss the supply side issues, what the producers are doing, what the investments are going to be, how much technology is going to be efficient, not necessarily talking about the technically less intensive efficient as much as the optimally efficient. So energy intensity is also equally important as energy efficiency. But discussing from the side of, let's say, lifestyle, which is the changes that you need to make, are more from the demand side oriented. And we often consider ourselves to be very small part of contributing to the overall scenario of mitigating climate impacts on CO2. But largely, if you look at from the global perspective, the environmental Kuznets curve comes into the picture, which is an inverse U-shaped curve. Globally, as the countries are going to grow in their per capita GDP levels, CO2 emissions are going to increase. They will reach a peak and then they will start coming down. And in the recent literature, it says then once again, there is going to be a gap and they will start going up. Now, most of the empirical work that has been conducted so far has shown that we are still on that phase of the U-shape where with growth, we are also emitting more. So when is the brink going to come and the reverse side is going to come in? And recent data is also showing that the innovations related to environment-friendly patents have actually started falling. So if the pace of innovations and R&D in the recent years, post 2012-13 have started to fall, what kind of future are we expecting to reach? When we discuss the lifestyle changes that need to occur, for instance, if we talk about the nutrition aspect, once again, there is evidence to show that as a result of climate change, when the rainfalls are going to become more volatile, standard deviations are going to increase, the temperature levels are rising across most of the major food grains, jawar, bajra, wheat, rice. Most of the times your productivity of food grains is falling. In a country like developing country like India, where as it is, we are food insecure, and with productivity levels falling further, it makes it so much important to have consumption and production which are sustainable. Are we doing enough? Don't think so. If the developed countries are working on unsustainable consumption patterns at the level of the household, the developing countries have unsustainable distribution patterns while the logistic system is extremely poor. Also, if lifestyle changes and behavioral changes have to take place, it's very important for us to understand what we are consuming in terms of a country which is water scarce. And India is hazardous in terms of its water security index and also very high in terms of the climate risk index. So if you're going to consume rice vis-a-vis millets, then we are going to be huge consumers of water. So bringing about a behavioral change, even not necessarily from the non-vegetarian to the vegetarian aspect, even understanding what we are consuming, it's so important to ensure that we are not making the country which is already scarce in water globally. We have to take such kind of initiatives. Also minor initiatives like in the transport sector. If you are going to go towards electric vehicles, how sustainable is their waste going to be? How do you manage the waste after a couple of years when the batteries are going to be dismantled? What are the systems for that? We don't know much about it. But yes, the kind of initiatives and sensitization which we've started doing from the aspect of institutions is immense. And I take pride to inform that in the past 10 years, the kind of changes that the students have also been informed are a lot. They're working. And if today's youth is going to transform into tomorrow's citizen, there is a lot to be learned from that. Within SRCC, some of the initiatives that we have done for lifestyle changes is a major proportion of our energy is coming from solar panels. We are the largest solar panels in the University of Delhi. During pandemic, we also earned revenues because it was going back to the grid. So not only were we emitting less in terms of going to cleaner energy, but also revenue generation model. We have a solid waste management system where segregation is taking place, and we are ensuring that there is a no open waste kind of a zone. Also, the students who are coming in pooled cars are given preference over parking. Alternate kinds of odd and even number of parking systems are there. And we have free cycles which are being provided to the students to commute from the metro and back. So these small initiatives, I think if they are taken up, including the air conditioning, which is going to be set at a 24 thermostat. So if this is going to be multiplied at the level of the district, cities, urban areas, I think these are steps in the right direction, but much less than what is desired. Thank you.
I think you actually broke it down not only to bite size, but I would say human interpretation as well. But lovely. I think in the interest of the ideas that this very panel has kind of laid down, it's my duty to kind of summarize them before we kind of close the panel and thank each one of the panelists individually. The first point I think which the panel has come up with is that India is going to be built 3 times, and probably the world is going to be no different, probably at least 2 times, if not 3. But I think Diksha laid a very important point that manufacturing is shifting bases, maybe from the so-called developed world to the so-called developing world, which is the global north to the global south, which actually means that fundamental changes in terms of circular economy need to be entailed. What this actually sort of what Akshay painted out a picture is that there needs to be a push in terms of R&D. There needs to be a push in terms of looking at new pricing mechanisms. Carbon could be one of them. And certainly, I think placing those partnerships. Ashok definitely pointed the fact that partnerships are existing, probably also trying to sort of find their own feet in this new world of trade and investments. And I think what Prabhav really sort of painted a picture is that a whole bunch of strategies need to be put in place before we literally set sail. Because as they always say, good planning will lead to good results. So I guess this was from the supply side, but I think this is where a word of caution emerged And I really cannot thank you enough for bringing in the dose of, I would say, pragmatism, and I would say a big dollop of common sense. Each and every time we were getting into esoteric arguments, Dr. Kaur, in terms of the need for change in behaviors and weaving it so nicely with your economic underpins. With this, I want to, and through this audience, applaud the panelists for this very enriching and interesting outcome.